Everyone thinks Mr. Nobody vanished because the story no longer needed him. But that belief is exactly what Fast and Furious is counting on. Because the moment you accept that he simply disappeared, you stop asking the one question that actually matters. What kind of system collapses if a single man truly leaves it? And Fast X quietly tells us the answer is none. Because Mr. Nobody never vanished. He changed position. From the very beginning, he was never just a government handler or a convenient excuse to give Dom a mission. He was an architect, someone who didn't build teams or fight wars directly, but designed pressure points. And that is why his absence is more dangerous than any on-screen death, because it signals that the system itself has gone underground. Fast X does not present chaos. It presents a controlled detonation, one where every explosion feels emotional and personal on the surface, but structural underneath, because the most dangerous players in this world never exit loudly. They step back and let everyone believe they are gone while the consequences keep unfolding. The first layer of this theory begins with a question the films never answer directly. Why Dominic Toretto, out of all criminals, racers, soldiers, and operatives in the world, was chosen by Mr. Nobody in the first place? And the answer was never loyalty or driving skill. It was refusal. Dom is one of the few people in this universe who cannot be owned, fully controlled, or permanently predicted. And Mr. Nobody didn't recruit him to follow orders. He recruited him to break systems that were already rotting from the inside. Every mission Dom completed didn't just stop a villain. It destabilized networks, erased black budgets, exposed hidden alliances, and over time that made Mr. Nobody a liability to his own employers. Because Dom doesn't fix problems, he ends them. And eventually the man who unleashed him became just as dangerous as the enemies he was meant to fight. This is where Mr. Nobody's disappearance stops looking like failure and starts looking like survival. Not survival of the man, but survival of the plan. The second layer explains where Mr. Nobody actually went. And Fast X gives us the clue not through dialogue, but through fragmentation, because once Tess enters the story, Mr. Nobody's role is no longer centralized. It's split between secrecy, legacy, and damage control, and that matters. Because Tess is not replacing her father. She is containing the fallout of what he started. Mr. Nobody didn't disappear because he lost control. He disappeared because he succeeded too well. The systems he destabilized were global. And when they collapsed, power vacuums formed. And those vacuums are exactly what Dante exploits. Which means Dante is not an anomaly. He is a consequence. Proof that this war was never about one enemy, but about exposing how fragile control really was. This leads directly to the forgotten presence of Little Nobody, whose absence is treated not as a mystery, but as an inconvenience, and that distinction matters, because Little Nobody was never meant to lead or command. He was meant to witness, someone close enough to see how deep Mr. Nobody's reach actually went. And removing him from the board is not about killing a character. It's about erasing testimony, which implies that Mr. Nobody's greatest threat was never what he did, but what he knew. And in this franchise, knowledge has always been more dangerous than weapons. Once you connect these threads, a clear pattern forms. Fast X is not showing the fall of a team. It is showing the exposure of a hidden war that Dom was never meant to fully understand. And that is why Tess becomes central. Her role is not emotional. It is structural. She functions as a firewall between Dom and the truth. Because if Dom realizes that every enemy he has faced since Fate of the Furious was part of the same collapsing system, the next step is not another mission. It is a reckoning, not against a villain, but against the world that kept using him as a controlled burn. This is where the theory locks into place. Mr. Nobody is not missing. He is inactive by design. And Fast 11 is not about his return as a character. It is about the reveal of his final move, stepping away so the system would consume itself, forcing players like Dante into the open, forcing governments to expose their desperation, and forcing Dom to confront the truth that he was never a weapon. He was the failsafe, the last option when control was already lost. That is why Fast X ends on a cliffhanger that feels unstable rather than tragic, because the story is not unfinished, the perspective simply hasn't shifted yet. In Fast 11, Mr. Nobody does not come back to give orders. He comes back as proof that everything Dom believed was random was orchestrated to reach a point of no return, where the old rules no longer apply, and the real conflict is no longer family versus villain, but freedom versus control. This reframes Tess one final time, because her presence is not about inheritance. It is about containment. She knows more than she says. And the way she chooses when to help and when to disappear mirrors the way her father operated. Selectively, surgically, always giving Dom just enough information to move forward, but never enough to see the entire board, which suggests Mr. Nobody never left. He compartmentalized himself, distributing influence so no single target could remove him. This brings us to the most overlooked contrast in the franchise. Mr. Nobody's real counterpart was never a villain like Dante or Cypher. It was Hobbs, because Hobbs represents visible institutional force, badges, muscle, intimidation, while Mr. Nobody represents invisible authority, deniable budgets, erased files, and decisions made without oversight. And the moment Hobbs returns, it signals imbalance. Because you do not bring brute force back unless invisible control has already failed. That means Mr. Nobody didn't disappear because he lost. He disappeared because the system he belonged to could no longer protect him. Dante, in this context, stops being the final villain and starts becoming a stress test, a product of years of hidden manipulation colliding with personal revenge. And the reason he can predict Dom so well is not intelligence. It is pattern recognition. He is reacting to cycles Mr. Nobody himself helped create. Escalation, sacrifice, emotional leverage. And that is why the ending of Fast X feels deliberately unresolved. Because the franchise is no longer pretending the world resets after each movie. The damage stacks, the consequences bleed forward, and Mr. Nobody understood that long before anyone else. What Fast X quietly suggests next is even more unsettling. Because once you stop looking at Mr. Nobody as a man and start looking at him as a mechanism, the entire franchise shifts genres. This is no longer an action saga. It becomes a controlled collapse, and every character is positioned not by loyalty, but by function. Dom represents uncontrolled force guided by emotion. Cypher represents adaptive chaos disguised as intelligence. Dante represents consequence weaponized into obsession. And Mr. Nobody represents the final disappearing act of centralized authority. And systems never vanish without replacement. They decentralize. That means Mr. Nobody's greatest move was not disappearing. It was teaching the world how to operate without him while still following the architecture he designed. This explains why enemies now feel less ideological and more personal. Because the system no longer enforces order. It provokes reaction. And Fast X shows this through how violence becomes symbolic rather than strategic. Bridges collapse, cities flood. Alliances fracture, not to win territory, but to send messages. Because once control is gone, fear becomes currency. This reframes Dom's role again. Because he is not fighting to restore balance. He is unknowingly accelerating the end of it. Every time he chooses family over institutions, emotion over command, he proves Mr. Nobody's original hypothesis correct. That centralized power cannot survive human unpredictability. The world after Mr. Nobody is not leaderless. It is exposed, and exposure is irreversible. The most telling sign comes from how governments behave in Fast X. Hesitant, fragmented, reactive, never fully present. Which implies that Mr. Nobody was not acting rogue. He was acting as the last stabilizer holding incompatible interests together. And once he stepped away, those interests turned inward. Creating figures like Dante who don't seek domination. They seek validation through destruction. This means Fast 11 is not about escalation. It is about convergence. All unresolved pressures collapsing into a single moment where Dom is no longer useful as a weapon, only as a choice. And that is far more dangerous to the system than any chase or explosion. In the final stretch, everything aligns. Mr. Nobody chose Dom not to win a war, but to expose one. He stepped away not to survive, but to remove the illusion of control. And he left Tess behind not as a successor, but as a buffer. Someone to ensure Dom reaches the end without realizing how much he has already changed the world around him. Fast 11 is not building toward the question of where Mr. Nobody has been. It is building toward the realization that he never truly left. He simply stopped pulling the strings directly, allowing chaos to surface so it could finally be confronted. And when that realization lands, the question of whether Mr. Nobody will appear again stops mattering, because his role has already been fulfilled. The system is exposed, the players are visible, and Dom is no longer reacting to missions. He is standing inside the consequences of all of them at once. Which means the real ending of this saga will not be about speed, or family, or survival. It will be about what happens when the man who controlled everything chooses to let go. and forces everyone else to live with the truth.